Okay. Boker Tov. Good morning and a good beginning of a new week. And today, as you see, the topic is, why does a good God give us difficulties and challenges? And this again is also a very weighted subject. And we are based on the parsha. We try to connect it to the Torah portion that we just read, that we're coming from and we're going to. So we will try to delve into one thought, one concept about it, because this is an age-old question that's been dealt with for thousands of years. It's also an emotional question. There's a story, or it's more like an anecdote about the difference between an intellectual question and an emotional question. You know, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad, about probably 250 years ago, a tremendous scholar and original thinker. What I mean by original, he's teaching Torah, but original depth in how he approaches Torah in general, and especially Hasidus, Jewish mysticism, etc. So the Alter Rebbe, throughout one of his seminal writings called Likutei Torah and Torah Or, one of the most often questions that he addresses, scattered throughout, because it's structured after also the parsha, so there are 53 portions, and one of the questions that is repeated again and again is the question is Lama Yorda Haneshama Lamata. Why did the soul descend down into this world? And the Alter Rebbe answers this question various places, and the question is, of course, since the soul comes from the most lofty place, why and for what purpose would it descend into a place that is devoid of the holiness, of course, that it experiences while it's in heaven? There must be a reason. It can't just be just to watch hockey or to play baseball. There must be a in-depth reason of Lama. And after the Alter Rebbe describes the tremendous holiness and greatness and environment that the soul, our soul, finds itself before it comes into this physical, selfish, materialistic body, he says, why would the soul come down into this world? And he answers this question again and again, and the anecdote starts over here, which is, why would the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, repeat this question after he's answered it multiple times? And he keeps on asking the question, Lama Yorda Haneshama Lamata, why did the soul come down here below? And the explanation that was given by one of the Hasidic mashpim was like a guidance or spiritual mentor, that in explaining this difficulty, he said that is the difference between a Cup Kasha and a Hatsukasha, for those who understand Yiddish. A Cup Kasha means a question, an intellectual. A cup means the head. A Cup Kasha means I have a question, an intellectual question, and that's that. I get an answer, and we move on. That's a Cup Kasha. A Hatsukasha, an emotional question, even after you get an intellectual answer for the question, since it's a Hatsukasha, it's a question of the heart, the question still irks you, and it still bothers you. And the Alter Rebbe, the Reb Zalman of Liadi, who was such a holy tzaddik, was such a spiritual person, this was to him just not an intellectual question of why did the soul come down into this world. It was an emotional heart question that bothered him and disturbed him so, because he felt and sensed the greatness of where the soul came from and the lowliness of where it's presently in this sort of materialistic world. That's why the question kept on coming up again and again. Lama yorda neshama lamata. Why did the soul have to come down? I know you gave me an answer, but it still bothers me. And that's the difference between a Cup Kasha and a Hatsukasha. So the question that we're asking today, which is, why does a good God give us difficulties and challenges, is a really, really deep emotional question that's been asked by sages and philosophers and theologians and so on throughout history. And we are not going to attempt to be the great philosopher here, but we want to derive some lesson from the Parsha. As I always say, Sunday morning, if you're joining us, and many of you do, and really I appreciate it, that you give me the opportunity here to share Torah and to share inspiration of the Parsha, etc. It's really very sort of meaningful and satisfying to me. So thank you very much for being part of this Sunday morning class. But the point is, it's not a quick, 3-minute, 2-minute, a TikTok presentation. It's a class. Let's sit, let's explore, let's learn, and hopefully we will come out with a satisfying answer, not only intellectually but also to the hearts, from where this question keeps on coming. Okay, so, and I see over here one of the listeners told me thank you, so I appreciate that. You're welcome, and thank you for your response. Okay, so by the way, on that note, before we go further, I do want to say that if you have any questions that we discuss here, especially if you think it's a question that others might benefit from hearing an answer, something that is said over here, please do not hesitate to, either during the class or afterwards, send me a message, and we'll try to address it in the next class. So questions, please, especially since the title of the class is about challenges. I'd love to be challenged, and and please do so that we could address it. Okay. So in this, there's one of the themes, one of the things that we find in the portion of this past week, Parshat Vayechi, and Jacob lived his last 17 years in Egypt. We also, this week, we're going to read about Shemot, which is Exodus, and the word Shemot means names, and we're dealing with the Jews as they develop into a nation in Egypt, in exile, and the difficulties and the challenges and the pain and suffering that they had while in Egypt, and then the Exodus, etc. So it begins last week to share some interesting tidbits, and it's all tied in. Last week we read about Jacob, as he comes to Egypt right after his arrival, and we read that he reaches out, or he summons his son. We forgot to make the bracha. Nobody's reminding me. We forgot to make the bracha on the coffee. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nihiya bidvaro. Okay, thank you for answering Amen. I heard it all the way here. I felt the spiritual response, the godly response. So in Parshas Vayechi, we read that Jacob, in his last 17 years, and as he is on his deathbed, he goes ahead and he summons his son, and he asks his son to bring Yosef and Menashe and Ephraim, his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Amongst other things that he requests from his son, primarily that his son should not allow him to remain in Egypt after his death, but he should bring him to the Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron and bury him over there. Hebron, the holy land of our forefathers. And Yosef, of course, accepts the oath that he will do so. And Jacob asks his son Joseph to bring Menashe and Ephraim, and he wants to bless them. He wants to bless his two grandchildren, right? Grandchildren are the best. Give us a thumbs up. I just had the great pleasure that as I was preparing for class here at Chabad, my grandchildren stopped by for an activity at Chabad. What could be a better surprise? What could be a better surprise than your grandchildren stopping by without you even knowing that they were coming? There's nothing greater in life. Okay, l'chaim, l'chaim. All the bubbies and zaydis, give us a thumbs up for our grandkids. L'chaim. So, Joseph goes ahead and he places Menashe and Ephraim in front of Jacob. Now he places Menashe, who's the older of the two sons, Ephraim, who is the younger of the two sons, and he places them right in front of Jacob, and he places Menashe on the right side of Jacob, because he's the older one, and Ephraim on the left side, he's the younger one. And in the Torah, in the Bible, it says that Jacob, although Jacob was already old, he was on his deathbed, and his eyes were weak, he nevertheless went ahead and sikel et yadav, the pasuk tells us. He smartly arranged his hands in a crisscross way, where he put his right hand on Ephraim, the younger one, and his left hand on Menashe. And Yosef says to his father, it seems like you're mixing things up over here, that Menashe should be having your right hand. And Yaakov says the following, he says, Yodaiti b'ni Yodaiti, I know Menashe will get blessings, but however, Ephraim, his younger brother, Yigdal Mimenu, will be greater than him. And as Rashi explains, this refers to Joshua who came forth from Ephraim, who then, after Moses, as you know, led the Jewish people into the Holy Land, and therefore Yaakov, in his prophetic sense and vision, puts the right hand, which represents the stronger hand, onto Ephraim, the younger child. Okay? Like every part of the Torah, there are so many insights over here. It seems like Yosef was saying that Jacob forgot what's going on, or forgot who is the older and who was the. That Joseph, I believe, Joseph was saying to his father, you're making a mistake. You're being forgetful in a sense. So let's put this question on the burner, and let's move down the parsha this week. And I want to connect somewhat, talking about forgetfulness. It reminds me of on the humorous side, there was a hypnotist who came out to perform for the community, and he was just excellent, and everybody was mesmerized, hypnotized by his performance. And at one point, the hypnotist challenges the crowd. He says, who wants to come up, and I will, through the power of hypnosis, I will erase your memory for the last month. That was a challenge he presented to the crowd. Now, it's kind of... we are a composite of our memories, and God forbid someone has Alzheimer's, right? Basically, you lose your whole personality. Who are we? We are our memories. So everybody was afraid. Everybody was afraid to step up to the stage, to be the guinea pig here, for this to be proven and so on. But finally, one fellow in the audience gets up, and he's brave, and he gets up and he says, I'm ready. I'm okay. I'm good. I'm willing to take the challenge. And he walks up to the stage, and someone else from the crowd starts to shout, no, you can't. Don't do it. He says to the hypnotist. And so the fellow turns to this fellow that's so objecting so strongly, and he says to him, what's the problem? He says, look, just a week ago, this fellow took a $100,000 loan from me. I do not want him to forget what happened in the last month. So forgetting, it has its pluses, of course. Sometimes we need to forget, sometimes we shouldn't forget. In this week's Parsha, we find later on another story which relates to forgetting or not forgetting. And it's according to one of the commentaries, one of the very famous commentaries, had a terribly unfortunate historical effect years later. Let me explain. Here we have our trusted Chumash, the Bible, the Gutnick edition. Okay, a lot of wonderful commentaries over here. So here, let me read for you, straight out of the Torah, straight God's word. And over here, it discusses the following. It says, let me get to the place over here. After Jacob gives blessings to all his kindalach, to all his children, to the 12 tribes, and the Torah relates that Yaakov passed away, Yaakov passes away. The Torah then says like this, okay? I'm reading. I'll start with the Hebrew so that we should have the energy of God's actual words, and then I'll translate. Vayiru, this is in Genesis chapter 50, verse 15. Vayiru achei Yosef, and the brothers of Yosef saw ki meis avim. They saw that their father had died. Vayoimru, and they said the following: Lu yistemenu Yosef. Maybe Yosef will start to hate us or keep his grudge against us because we, the 10 out of the 11 brothers, Benjamin was not involved, we of the 10 brothers were involved in selling Joseph into slavery, which caused him terrible pain, and he was away from his father and his household in a strange land without internet connection, without WhatsApp, without Instagram, without Facebook, etc., etc. For 22 years, he was away from his beloved father who loved him the most of all his kids. So after Jacob's passed away, they said, Lu yistemenu Yosef, maybe Yosef will hate us. V'hoshev yoshiv lonu es kol hara asher gamalnu oiseh. And perhaps he will return, he will pay us back for all of the bad things that we did to him. So, by Yitzavu, so he says like this, they went ahead, they made a plan and instructed messengers to go to Yosef and say the following: your father instructed us before his death. And here there's an argument amongst commentaries whether Jacob actually instructed or this was something the brothers were fabricating for the sake of peace. And that's a discussion on its own right. How and why and how can it be done? Regardless, we learn one of the things we learned from this, how important peace is, that you could even, bend the truth. But faranandishmol, as we say in Yiddish, for another time. Saying, the Torah continues, this is what you should say to Yosef. Please will you now forgive the wrongdoing of your brothers and their sin, that they did evil things to you. So please will you not, please will you now forgive the wrong of the servants of God of your father, and the God of your father, and for even though your father died, his God is alive. This is taken from the commentary. When the messenger spoke to him, Yosef wept, and he said the following. His brothers also wept, and they fell down in front of him and said, look, we are your slaves. Yosef said to them, don't be afraid, for am I instead of God? You plan to do things to me by selling me or wanting to kill me, but God had already intended that what you did to me should happen for good reasons, in order to make things like they are today, where I'm keeping a great number of people alive. Yosef, as you remember, devised a plan to make sure that society, Egypt being the superpower, society at large, would be sustained during the terrible years of famine. So don't be afraid now. I will provide for you and your children. To comfort them, he continued to comfort them and spoke more words of encouragement to their hearts. This is the words of the Holy Torah. Now, what is it that all of a sudden caused the brothers to be concerned? It seems like there was some change of behavior. Now, you could just say that their father died and all of a sudden they were concerned, but it would make more sense to say that there was some change of behavior on Yosef's part, that the brothers all of a sudden said, perhaps Yosef now wants to take revenge, or will take revenge now that our dad is gone. And there are two things that we find in the commentaries. Rashi brings from the Talmud that while Jacob was alive, they would all eat together, to talk about how important it is to eat as a family together. That's a bit more challenging today, to be able to get our family off devices and off interruptions that happen via the devices, and to be able to eat together as a family. That is such an important moment in the bond of a family and what happens during that mealtime, that we should make an effort to make it happen more often. So Yosef, after Jacob died, stopped eating with the family. Why he stopped is also a discussion, and that was the reason why they were concerned. Another reason given, because we're talking about forgetfulness, is because they thought that Yosef practically sort of forgot what they did to him. Meaning it was sort of out of his mind. It's in the past, many years ago. It's by now it's 22 plus 17. So we're looking at 39 years ago, right? And so by now, sure, he moved on, so to speak. However, as one of the commentaries points out, the Medrash, I believe it is, says that when Yosef was returning with his brothers from Jacob's funeral, they went by the pit in which Yosef was placed. And Yosef made the blessing. In Hebrew, the blessing is Baruch Atah Hashem, bless you God. And the end of the blessing is Sha'asa li nes b'mokam hazeh. God, who has performed for me a miracle in this place, he saved my life. Which is a mitzvah, an obligation, that if you had a life-saving miracle at a given place, and you pass that place, that you make this blessing. When Yosef, on the way back from Jacob's funeral, stopped and made this blessing, they said, oh, Yosef has not forgotten. It's still on his mind. He just made this blessing, and that was a reason that in their mind they thought that Yosef still holds a grudge against them, and now that dad is gone, he will mete out punishment towards them for what they did to him. It's interesting, and I found this quite fascinating, not necessarily in a good way, that one of the early commentators on the Torah, known as Rabbeinu Bachya, one of the very famous commentators, says the following. Many of you probably know that both on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av, we read the prayer of the 10 martyrs, the 10 great sages that the Roman emperor killed. And he said he did so. It's the famous prayer. Some of you who are in cantorial, there's a very famous cantorial piece by Chazan, by Cantor, Zevel Kvarten, called Tiheir Rabbi Yishmael Satzmai. Tiheir Rabbi Yishmael Satzmai. It's a very known piece. Any Chazan cantor that is worth his weight sort of knows this piece by Zevel Kvarten, Tiheir Rabbi Yishmael Satzmai, and that discusses about the 10 martyrs that we read on Yom Kippur, that the Roman Caesars killed, and they did so as an atonement for the fact that 10 brothers sold Yosef. And Rabbeinu Bachya says something which is For the most part, the commentators always talk about the greatness of Yosef, that he did not take revenge of his brothers, and that he forgave his brothers wholeheartedly. But Rabbeinu Bechaya differs. In Torah we have often multiple opinions. Rabbeinu Bechaya says that when the brothers go ahead and they say, your father told us, your father commanded that you should forgive your brothers and so on, we find Yosef giving them words of comfort, but we do not find Yosef saying, I have forgiven you, I forgive you. We do not find that. And the Rabbeinu Bechaya says that because Yosef didn't actually forgive them, the punishment later on in history of the 10 martyrs, the terrible death of the greats like Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, etc., the greatest of our sages were murdered by the Roman Caesar as an atonement because Yosef didn't fully forgive them. I mean, that's very, very difficult and powerful statement. So I'm sharing that with you, talking about the harm that can befall for not full forgiveness. Now, obviously, we're talking about great righteous men, and whatever they do is held to a far greater standard, and the impacts of their actions are far more weighted, and etc., etc. But nevertheless, the lesson, and since we're told about this, and Torah doesn't just mean a guide, but Torah is from the word mora, teacher, which means that we take a lesson from it. So these are powerful words. But let me get back to our discussion, and with that, I will try to conclude. Why Jacob? Why Jacob went ahead? We're talking about forgetfulness, and lack of forgetfulness. That Jacob, where Yosef thought that perhaps Yaakov made a mistake, he forgot who was the older, and so on. It's kind of obvious that wasn't the case because Yaakov went ahead and crisscrossed his arms. Now, one of the commentators, I think it's maybe the Kleyokar, I'm not sure who, says that Yaakov assumed that Yosef will put the right to his right as he's facing Yaakov, so he went ahead and crisscrossed his arms. But that's hard to accept, with all, of course, proper respect for the holy commentaries. But it's an obvious question. If that would have just been that, the Torah wouldn't even tell us that detail. The fact that Torah tells us this means that there's real insight here to be learned. And Yaakov went ahead and deliberately changed the position of his arms. So, various explanations. But I want to focus on one explanation that the Rebbe gives us with a very powerful lesson, and it goes to the title of our class, about challenges and so on. L'chaim. The question that we asked was, why does a good God give us challenges and struggles? There is nobody in life that escapes difficulties and challenges. Some more painful, less painful. There's a saying in Yiddish, Alts bei einem and nicht bei keinem. Nobody has it all. So Menashe and Ephraim, from all of Jacob's grandchildren that came to Egypt, of course, they were the only two that were born in Egypt, away from the entire family, away from the love, dedication, values, sort of warmth, moral teachings of their grandfather. They were born in Egypt, which at the time was a very decrepit and sort of coarse society. The Talmud uses the expression "shtufei zima." The Egyptians were sexual immorality was rampant. There was just not an environment for nice Jewish grandkids, for any grandkids, especially grandkids of our forefathers who were there, as God said, to bring the teachings of holiness and spirituality into the world. And here we have two grandchildren raised in an environment. So symbolically it represents, on a more Jewish level, it represents the diaspora, the Jew that's in exile, the Jew that is going through the challenges of being outside of his homeland and environment. And on a greater level, it represents any human being, good human being that is away from the environment that of their traditions and their holiness and their godliness, etc. So Menashe and Ephraim, their names, why they were given the name Menashe and Ephraim, the Torah tells us why they were given that name. Menashe was given the name, the Torah says, Yosef named him Menashe, Ki nashani Elokim mikol beis avi. God made me forget the home of my father's household, father's family, my family. And one of the explanations to that is that the reason why he gave his son that name is so that he shouldn't forget. That whenever he says the name Menashe, he should recognize and realize that he's an environment that lends itself, that he forgets and he assimilates into the environment that he's in. Menashe, the name was to remind him that he should not. And this is an extremely difficult task. When you are the lone person in an entire society that has an entire different set of values, social etiquette, social beliefs, and you go ahead and you maintain who you are, what your beliefs, what your history, what your parents are, what your grandparents are, you stay strong to that, that is incredibly difficult. We see in our world that we are in now, for someone to maintain their roots, their Jewish values, Torah values, holy values, your family's values, in the face of what everybody around you is challenging and maybe mocking. There's a lack of acceptance. You maintain you're different. It's very difficult. So Menashe represents Yosef's tremendous success in being able to do so. I say this also because we asked about challenges. And why would a good God give us challenges? And there's a letter where the Rebbe responds to someone who sends him a question of why, if God wants us to keep Torah and mitzvahs, why did he Torah and mitzvahs and do good deeds? Why did he send us into exile where it's so difficult and it's so challenging? And it reminds me of a short video clip that I saw of my stepdad, who raised me, that he was being interviewed by one of the societies. I don't know if it was the Spielberg archives, where they interviewed Holocaust survivors and so on, and they asked him what it was like, because my dad at age either 11 or 12 was put, and I think I've shared this in the past, was put into a Russian prison for being caught in a Jewish cheder during the communist era. And they asked my dad, this was shortly before he passed away at age 93, I believe. He lived a long life of 93, I believe, or 94, I think it was 93. And he was asked what it was like as a child to be challenged or to be put into prison. And he said like this: on the one hand, we live now in a wonderful country, in a life of freedom in the United States of America, which he deeply appreciated. He said, but on the other hand, the connection that he felt to his Judaism while he was a child being put into prison for his Jewish connection, that bond was far greater because of the challenge, because of the opposition. So while we never wish anybody to have that kind of difficulty, but the reality is that only when you're challenged, and this is on a human level, this is on a Jewish level, only when you are challenged are your deepest resources brought to the forefront, and you recognize and realize strength that you don't know you even had. And as a result, once those strengths come forward, it changes you as a person forever, for the better. So we don't ask for these challenges. We don't wish it on anybody else. But in the language of the Zohar, the source of Jewish mysticism, the Bible sort of Jewish mysticism, God in his goodness does not want us to have nahama dichsufa. That's an Aramaic word, so we're learning some Aramaic over here. Nahama dichsufa means shameful bread. God does not want us to have bread of shame. What is bread of shame? Bread of shame is when you get something without any effort. And because Hashem wants us to have effort, which that's when it's valuable. So two things happen over here when we're being challenged. Number one, it's not bread of shame because we earned it. We worked for it. We were challenged. And number two, it brings out much deeper strength within us that without the challenge, we wouldn't have. I remember hearing and reading, I'm not so good with remembering names. One of the known runners, I believe it was in the 1940s, that the early 1940s, that he, at that point, the accepted scientific conclusion was that a human being cannot run faster than, per mile than a certain, whatever the minute point, whatever it was, based on just the structure of the human being, on the velocity, on the wind opposition, and etc. That a human being just cannot beat a certain record that was held up to that point in time. And then was it Jesse Owens? I don't remember who it was right now. And he smashed the record. And after that, quite a number of people went ahead and smashed the original record, which up to then nobody could smash. What happened? What happened was that all of a sudden now there's a new challenge that was set higher. It brought out, up to that point, that was the challenge to break. Once that challenge was broken, the original number was not a challenge anymore. So that number didn't have to bring out the deepest qualities and talent and gifts of whoever those runners were. And so too in life. Menashe represents in a world of challenge, we overcome, and that brings out the deepest within us. What does Ephraim represent? Ephraim represents not only do you survive challenges, and that brings out the greatest strength, but you actually thrive, and you, in a sense, transform. You grow from it. The word Hephrani Elikim Beretz on you, which is what the name Ephraim is. Hephrani means to be fruitful, to grow like a tree that gives forth fruit. Right? So Ephraim represents a step beyond, and the real purpose of why we're put into these challenges is not just to maintain, not to fall apart, to stand strong, but actually to grow, to bear fruit. Not only to survive, but to thrive. And not only to thrive ourselves, but to bring goodness and bring those around us to a better place. Not only to go ahead and to maintain and not be influenced by those who are trying to influence us, but actually to be an influencer, a positive influencer. Hephrani, to bear fruit. I was just before I was giving class, there was a fellow, thank God, we've had many people move into the community over here over the last year or two. And there's someone that's coming here to check out the community. And of course, at that point, you got to be on your best behavior. You know how it works. You want to make a good impression. And once they move in there, you could start trying to abuse them. Only kidding about that. And so I asked him what he does. What he does for a living, what he does. He says, you know what I do? I take the deepest teachings of Torah, Hasidus, which is Jewish mysticism on its highest level, and I consult. I'm a consultant for business people, and I show them how ideas in these deepest levels of Hasidus, how it could enhance and make their business better. Amazing. So to take even a simple example, I learned a mimer. He says, I was learning a mimer that's called a Hasidic discourse that discusses about joy and how to achieve joy from a Hasidic perspective. And I adopt that and I show how in different areas of that person's business, how they could bring it into enhancing their business. And many examples. In other words, not only is he surviving by maintaining his identity, he is transforming the sort of real world around him. He's bearing fruit, using the Torah, using the beautiful teachings of our tradition, and bearing fruit, making the world around a better world. That's wonderful. That's fantastic. So, to just sum it up, why does a good God give us challenges? Because if there would be zero challenges, no challenges, it would be bread of shame. It would be unearned. Any parent that likes his child gives the child challenges so that they earn what their achievements are. Number two, it brings out deeper elements, deeper resources within the person, and that's when you are challenged. And number three, not only in the ideal sense, which is why Jacob went ahead and put his right hand on Ephraim, the ideal sense is not only do the challenges bring out the strengths within you, but then you not only survive, but you thrive and you transform and bring goodness and holiness, which is our purpose and mission of why we've come down. Lama Yorda Neshama, we started in the beginning of class. Why does the soul come down in this world? To make this world a better place, a kinder place, and we do so through the lens of and the teachings and the words of Hashem, who is the absolute, who's absolutely good and is also the absolute arbiter of what's good and what's right and what's just. And societies and individuals who implement that in their lives, by and large, have been happier, more successful. Societies have been more successful. As soon as God has been thrown out of societies, unfortunately, societies have fallen apart and have rotted from within. And that's a sad reality, and that's a sad truth. So our job, in a positive way, in a loving way, is to be the Ephraims of our time. Every single person has infinite light that they can create around them. So that's the thought for the day. Thank you for listening. I know class went a little bit longer than usual, but it's Sunday morning. It's Torah time, Torah and coffee. So everybody have a fantastic day, a fantastic week. Thank you for listening. Please share these words of Torah. Just be the Ephraim. Every Ephraim is amazingly needed and effective. And by divine providence, you have your circle where you have to be the Ephraim of your circle, your footprint. Have a great week.